you so much, Jacob and Banyen Books, for hosting this event. Thank you very much to GUBC and the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation Program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society for helping co-sponsor this event, Michelle for helping with outreach, and of course, thank you so much, Jessica, for joining me in conversation. I'm really excited for our conversation. So I thought since we just have an hour, I would read just a really short section from my book, something that actually has been on my mind a lot lately in this time of a lot of people thinking about issues of race and thinking about solidarity, which is actually the title of I suppose, the title of the last chapter of my book. In one of my favorite parts of Wan's November 2014 film interview, Aaron riffs on why it drives him crazy when people think all Asian American Buddhists practice Buddhism in the same way. It's the notion that if you go to Faying Si, this temple in the San Gabriel Valley, everyone you talk to has the exact same idea and they do the exact same thing in terms of Buddhism. You wouldn't know that if you talk to different people there, they all have different reasons for being there. Aaron brings up his friend Gary as an example. Originally from Hong Kong, Gary volunteers every week at Dharma Seal Temple, Chinese name Fa Ying Si, directing traffic. When he was unemployed, Gary made a vow. If he were to get a certain job that he needed to support his family, it was a good blue-collar job, he would become a regular volunteer at the temple. He prayed, and he got the job. The reason why I bring this up is because I think on the one hand, people will see this and they'd be like, oh, that's what Asian American Buddhists are. They're those people who want material things and they pray for it. But Aaron urges us not to be so dismissive. For starters, who isn't inclined to take action to pursue what they want, whether through prayer or some other method? Furthermore, volunteering at the temple changed the way Gary practices Buddhism. Being at the temple all the time, he interacted frequently with the monks and nuns and developed a deeper understanding of Buddhism through their teachings. That's a really cool story, but a lot of people stop there at this notion of Asian American Buddhists are just immigrant, superstitious Buddhists. And I think it's true that if you go to a temple and you look for that, that's what you'll find. Aaron compares this to going to Paris with a list of all the things you want to see. Sure, you'll come home having met your expectations about the city. But if you go to the Chinese neighborhood where Aaron's uncle lives, you'll experience a completely different Paris than if you'd hit up all the tourist sites. Especially if you don't grow up around Asian American Buddhists and all you know is what your mostly white Dharma Center teaches you about what Buddhism in America is, you're just hearing these legends of these Asian American Buddhists and their communities yonder. Aaron isn't bringing up all of this to be divisive. It's really sad that stereotypes prevent people from understanding American Buddhists for who we are, simply because I like to think that if we were part of one community, we'd be greater together than we are apart. In fact, Aaron's message is the exact opposite of separation. I'd like to think the reason why diversity is so important is because each of us sees the world through a different lens. We only see a very narrow piece of the world. And so when you get all of our perspectives together, we have a better understanding of what the world is and how things work. We have a better understanding as Buddhists of how people suffer and how to alleviate suffering and how to work together as a community and support each other as a community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's typical of the personal, emotional, no holds barred writing that Chenxing Han brings to this particular book. It has been a delight to read and explore. And since she has given us a short selection that deals with Aaron Lee, I was thinking that perhaps Chenxing could begin by talking about who this person is who is behind so much of the book, and someone who, if any of my students have joined us tonight, they might recognize from our discussions of the Angry Asian Buddhist blog.
So that's right. Before I knew Aaron as Aaron, I knew him as the Angry Asian Buddhist. And this was a blog began in 2009 by an anonymous person who was starting to write about issues of race and representation in American Buddhism. And in particular, he was curious and concerned that, you know, the majority of American Buddhists, 2/3 of Buddhists in the United States, for instance, are of Asian heritage, but in the mainstream, especially English language media, their voices are so seldom represented. It would seem that white converts really dominate that space. And he got the title Angry Asian Buddhist from the Angry Asian Man, which I don't know how, well known it's known to the audience here or to Canadian audiences, but that was a blog founded by Phil Yu, who was talking about, actually is because the blog still runs, is talking about these issues within the broader Asian American community. But Aaron was really interested in focusing on the Buddhist community. And I think it's a very powerful title. Certainly, it makes us just take pause that we usually think of Asian Americans as a sort of model minority. Oh, they don't get angry. They're always calm. They don't rock the boat. And we think of Buddhists as, one could say, an almost a model minority religion in the same way. Oh, you're not supposed to be angry, right? That can be seen as a poison within Buddhist practice. And so I read this, and he was really one of the first people I heard talking about these issues. And it got me thinking about what it means to be Asian American and Buddhist as someone who was not raised Buddhist, in fact. And Aaron himself, once I got to know him, has a complex identity, I think, sort of as all of us do, really, but he is half Toishanese Chinese, half Ashkenazi Jewish. And I write throughout the book, as people who read Be the Refuge will know, he's really woven throughout the book. The book is indebted to him. The title is indebted to Aaron. And there's so much more I could say, but I guess I would say that it was first his writing and then really his friendship that propelled this book into being. And he um, tragically passed away in 2017 of cancer at the age of 34. And so, in many ways, Aaron is a continued benefactor of this book. I have a picture of him that I keep actually by my desk for these events. So, I remember when I first reached out to him, Aaron was, of course, very active on the Buddhist blogosphere at the time, and so was very fortunately my advisor at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, Scott Mitchell. So Scott put me in touch with Aaron, and I remember being just petrified that he would be really mean, like really grumpy. And he was just one of the kindest, most generous people you would ever meet. And I think this one quote really describes well. Jeff Yang has described the Angry Asian Man in this way, and I think this quote really describes Aaron's writing as well. But it is occasionally angry, but primarily better described as open, passionate, and defiant about the rights of Asian Americans to be included and the need for Asian American voices uh, to be heard, and the responsibility of Asian Americans to participate. So there's a lot there. I think I should read it again, but the rights of Asian Americans to be included, the need for Asian American voices to be heard, and the responsibility of Asian Americans to participate. So I saw Aaron always writing from a place of actually deep love for American Buddhist communities, and he wanted to see the diversity of American Buddhist communities represented. So his spirit really animates this book from cover to cover.
Aaron's presence in the book, other mentor figures, and those who have influenced you really have a presence on the pages of this book, but so do you. That is your personal feelings, your reactions to situations, a wonderful, lyrical, thick description of all the different places you've been. For example, the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley. I've spent many times there, but now I know what color the floor is. And I now know what the light above my head is doing. So I found that my own memory of places that I visited that you described was in fact enhanced by, again, this wonderful lyrical description that you bring to your subject. And on that note, I wanted to ask a little bit about the long and probably arduous journey towards getting this book published, because it's not typical. It's uh, memoir, scholarship, interview, activist. There's all kinds of dimensions to this particular book that don't fit comfortably into any category. I have a close friend and colleague who now writes what I would call Buddhist historical fiction. And she has discussed this strange thing that happens when you try to do something scholarly, but that doesn't fit into the precise scholarly format that, say, an academic press is looking for. So I was hoping that perhaps you could talk a little bit about what it was like trying to get a work that's this composite published, and again, just impress upon our audience how unique this book is in terms of that composite, bringing academic as well as really just excellent direct writing together.
Thank you. I love that you talk about the Jodo Shinshu Center there in Berkeley, and to ground it in a place that I describe in quite a bit of detail in the early chapters. And it's fitting because I think it's actually hard for me to imagine another birthplace for a book of this nature. You know, here's a seminary that's been around since 1949, that's gone through multiple generations, that trains Jodo Shinshu ministers, but also trains Buddhist chaplains from all different backgrounds, that also teaches students from other schools of the Graduate Theological Union, people who are Christian or Muslim or of different backgrounds as well. So I think that that kind of inclusivity and diversity of voices is there. I think had I been at a quote unquote more academic program, I might not have been able to bring in the more elements of Buddhist chaplaincy, for example, which I was studying while at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, chaplaincy, spiritual care. And yeah, the journey of this book, my goodness, it began maybe in 2012 was probably my first interview. I think it's accompanied me through young adulthood. I'm not sure I can really identify as a young adult so much anymore, but the many iterations, you know, first thinking, okay, I just need a master's thesis. That's how it started, very humbly. And then thinking, okay, maybe a few people will talk to me about this topic. And then suddenly I interviewed 26 people in person. These interviews were an hour and a half to 5.5 hours long. So it just felt like, oh, I think I've really struck a chord. I did an additional 63 interviews via email because there were just so many people who wanted to talk to me. But, you know, I couldn't fly over the US for that. And then, yeah, after I graduated, I sort of had this feeling like, oh dear, this is way bigger than an MA thesis. And I don't think I just wanted to like hide in a library somewhere. And maybe I need to write a book out of this. And there are a couple, I guess there's a couple two big turning points I can say. One is I remember, so this must have been as I was about to enter into year-long chaplaincy training, which kind of put the brakes on writing for a little bit. But I remember going to an event with Ruth Ozeki, whom I assume many people know and love, since she also has spent a lot of time in Canada, as well, the wonderful novelist and Zen Buddhist priest. And she was very gracious afterwards at the end of the event when I asked her, you know, I've got this thesis, and what would you recommend in terms of like turning it maybe into a book? And so she gave this beautiful piece of advice of just making it make it an account of your curiosity, write yourself into the book. And it took many years, I think, for me to actually let that advice sink in and to follow it. So in full disclosure, I did manage to eke out a first draft of this book, and it was very academic, and it even went through peer review at an academic publisher, and that was part of its journey. But as one can imagine, I'm sort of grateful now that it didn't work out at the academic publisher. And when Erin died, that was the second big piece, I would say. Just everything shifted. The book I'd written before just didn't really make sense anymore. I threw the whole thing out and stared at a blank page and started from scratch. And what I felt was needed was a book that could speak to Aaron and his friends, a book that I would love to see used in undergraduate classrooms, even high schools. And in fact, I'm pleased to say it's starting to be taken up in both of those spaces. So where people, especially who are Asian American Buddhists, if they're taking class on American Buddhism, they're taking a class in ethnic studies, they can see something of their culture, something of maybe their parents or grandparents, or just something familiar represented, rather than to feel alienated. It just seemed like there was such a lack for a book that really looks at Asian American Buddhists as a pan ethnic category and also as a pan sectarian category, because we're talked about in this way, like almost like lumped together, oh, Asian Buddhist, right? But there's not enough of us speaking for ourselves. And so that was the kind of painful, uncomfortable process of writing myself more in the book when I finally realized, okay, I need to share some stories so that readers get to know me. I'm a narrator. That is a thread throughout the whole book. And it seemed unfair to have people share so deeply and intimately of their own experience and not to reveal more about myself.
I definitely plan on using this in my undergraduate courses. So I'm grateful that you wrote it, and grateful for all the experiences that bring the pages as they are to us. Speaking of undergraduate classes and understanding what the experiences of Asian Canadian and Asian American Buddhists are, one of the big things that you challenge in this book is the so-called two Buddhisms theory. So to bring our audience up to speed and then to highlight the intervention that Chenxing is making, I was wondering if first you could tell us a little bit about what is this two Buddhisms theory, and then how your book tries to work uh, through that to something on the other side where experience becomes recognizable.
So, some of Jessica's students are on this call. You might be familiar with this as a sort of scholarly concept that's been talked a lot about in American Buddhism, debated a lot. So, let me just read a short paragraph from my book because I think that might help summarize it very concisely. The dominant story of Buddhism in America is that there are two Buddhisms, the Buddhism of white converts and the Buddhism of Asian immigrants. What differentiates these two distinctly and mutually isolated brands of Buddhism? That's in scare quotes. We are told, for starters, that Western/white Buddhists focus on meditation practice in keeping with their rational and modernist bent, whereas Asian American Buddhists, and unfortunately those two are often conflated, prefer the quote unquote traditional and devotional rituals of chanting and bowing. It's not hard to guess which group is more likely to be dismissed as superstitious and which group is more likely to be celebrated as scientific. So, this two Buddhisms kind of dichotomy that's been set up, even if it wasn't originally intended to sort of racialize people into these two categories, has over the years, often in both academic and also especially popular media, become this kind of separation. And I've actually heard something by Drew Baker, who's the author of Converting American Buddhism. I was reading his book, which is focused on the experience of second generation white convert Buddhists. And I think something provocative he suggests is, in a way, it's as if there's only one Buddhism, a sort of white convert meditating superior sense of Buddhism. And then it creates this second Buddhism as almost what I would call a retrograde foil. So, like, oh, not meditating, like superstitious, like these are kind of inferior practices, right? And so, first of all, we know but I have heard in some book events, some people say when they learned about two Buddhisms, it was their first time realizing, oh, there were Buddhists besides white converts. So, in that sense, two Buddhisms is better than one Buddhism. And actually, one could imagine the inverse being true, like maybe someone who's been very immersed in Asian American Buddhist communities, actually, and not reading magazines like Lions or a Tricycle might actually be surprised to realize, like, oh, like there's a big group of, not just white converts, actually, like Black and Latinx and people of all backgrounds, and even Asian American converts practicing a different form. So I would say, I guess, two Buddhisms is an improvement on one Buddhism, but I'd like to go have us go much further. So first of all, as many of my interviewees pointed out, where are our Black Buddhist friends, right? And I think there are surveys coming out in Gen Z that's showing how much more racially diverse it is. And so where are our Latinx friends and our Native American Buddhist friends and all this? What about mixed race people, right? Like this kind of, a white Asian racial binary is just obviously not going to be complete. Um, so in my book, I think I'm starting to explore, what happens when we also consider generation? And by generation, I mean multiple, there's ways to think about this word generation, right? I know certainly in the US, like for Asian Americans, we're often labeled, I would say, by our generational status as immigrants, like if we're first generation, second generation, third generation, et cetera. I myself might identify as 1.75 generation because I was born in China, but came to the US when I was very young, at the age of 4. And that's my experience will be different than someone like Aaron, whose Toisanese side can trace their Toisanese heritage multiple generations in the US. But I'd like to not just limit us into thinking about that, right? Because that reminds us like Asian American are not just carbon copies of their parents or grandparents. I mean, that's an obviously ridiculous concept, but I think sometimes that gets assumed when we forget to attend to age and generation. But there's also the idea of generation, just like what historical generation, right? So most of the people in my book are millennials and Gen X. So maybe we're not so young anymore. I think I'd love to see this book, a new version of this book for Gen Z. So I think there are always going to be continually new generations of Asian American Buddhists. And then also, I would just to bring up this idea of what generation American Buddhist are you? This is something one of my interviewees, Noel Alumit, brought up. And that brought to me a whole fresh new way of thinking about this because we don't tend to think about, oh, I'm a first gen or convert Buddhist because I'm the first person in my family to be Buddhist in America. Someone who's Jodo Shinshu might consider themselves a multi-gen American Buddhist because their family has been American Buddhists in this country for multiple generations, right? And then someone who's second generation, perhaps their parents immigrated from Cambodia or Laos or Vietnam or Thailand or many other different countries in Asia, and they were raised Buddhist. So their experience is as a second gen Buddhist. And in fact, this is how I ultimately ended up structuring my book, where part 1 is focused on multi gen Buddhists, part 2 is focused on second gen Buddhists, part 3 is focused on first gen or convert Buddhists, and part 4 weaves together voices from all of the previous 3 parts.
So continuing on that thread, um, how how do we get past or include more than the two Buddhisms set of stereotypes? What do we do with them, and how do we get past them?
It's a really tricky question. And I feel we're still grappling with this, right? I don't think my book has the answers, but I think it's trying to push us into conversations where we might imagine some of these answers. Certainly I've heard of people talk about using lineage as a way to differentiate Buddhists. And I think that's also um, fun to think about. I was just talking with a friend and she was saying, I feel like we're in the lineage of Aaron. We're in the lineage of the angry Asian Buddhists, right? Many of my interviewees come from multiple lineages. So we can see how this sort of denominational model and lineage model is helpful and might also have its own limits. And I think to me, as I talk to people about how would you categorize American Buddhism? What are some ideas you have? I think what's humbling is that maybe there's a way in which we have to remember no single model is going to be perfect, right? Every model is probably going to have its strengths and limitations. And I think the issue with two Buddhisms is that when it feels like it's the one singular model rather than one model among many that has its own strengths and limitations, that's I think where we get into trouble when that model is used in ways that denigrate Asian Americans. That's when we start causing actually harm and suffering, even if that's not the intention of this model. So looking at the time, on page 245 and 246 of my book, I do ask people, and I'm thinking, I have Holly talking about how she would really love to hear people define themselves? How do they describe themselves, right? I have other interviewees suggesting categorizing by intensity of practice, like how intensively do you practice Buddhism? The whole first gen, second gen, multi-gen. There's just yeah, I can read this brief passage. In presenting their ideas for how to sort American Buddhists into different categories, these young adults call forth a cornucopia of variables: age, race, ethnicity, gender, class, language, way of practice. Do they meditate, chant, bow, etc.? Degree of outness, secret or hidden versus vocal Buddhists. Way of relating to Buddhism. Do they take a utilitarian, philosophical, academic, or religious approach, an individual or communal approach, a private, familial, or public approach, and so on and so forth? And I think what's really helpful is that remembering generally saying all racialized people of a certain category are going to do something in a certain way is just always going to be limited because that's a very diverse category. But it was so humbling to listen to all these people and think like, oh my gosh, how can we think about almost like an intersectional Buddhism, a Buddhism that's truly multiple? We talk about multiple Buddhisms. I hear that used a lot in the classroom, but are our models keeping up with the ways we talk about multiple Buddhisms? I think arguably we're still not quite there yet. But I think more and more people are really trying to grapple with this. And I think I'm especially inspired by the younger generation, where I think there's so much attunement to these issues already. And when I zoom into like high school or undergrad classrooms, it's been really amazing just to hear the questions people are asking around the intersections of these different issues. And finally, I guess I would just say language. Among a lot of Asian American Buddhists I've been talking to, that language piece feels really important. So it's sort of like almost irrespective of one's racial background, if you have a lot of fluency or familiarity or comfort in a certain age, let's say, Khmer, then you might feel much more comfortable going to the Cambodian Buddhist temple. And that's not an entirely random example, right? My husband, who's white and Buddhist, but is fluent in Khmer, arguably feels more comfortable in Khmer Buddhist temples than I do. So I think that language piece is actually really important too. But in language, it's not like there's two Buddhisms, because people of one Asian background don't necessarily, Sri Lankan Buddhist doesn't necessarily just walk into a predominantly Tibetan Buddhist space and understand everything that's going on, and vice versa. They might see resonances, but there will also be differences. So again, I think so much of my book is really trying to remind us just of the very real kinds of diversity and the kinds of connections that are possible because of that diversity, and also, frankly, some of the tensions that exist because of that diversity.
Since we have stopped on that word tension, I know that there are a lot of other things going on right now with the pandemic, with different pressures, with a sharp rise in both Canada and the United States in anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian violence. I know that this is something that is very important to all of us, but it's something that you're also dealing with professionally in terms of activism and organizing. So I was hoping that you could speak about some of the work you're doing, as well as just address the topic of racism and what it has meant in your lives and the lives of the people that you're interviewing, and what do we do?
Thank you. Yeah, such a big question, and feels like a very important one. I mean, I'm reflecting on how, the long journey of this book meant that when it was being written, there's maybe a mention of Black Lives Matter in my book, which was really, becoming, building to being. And I think it's helpful also, I should note that after I finished a year-long chaplaincy residency here in California, I actually spent most of the Trump presidency based in Southeast Asia. So I was kind of like away from the US as so much was happening, right? And I landed back really only during this pandemic period. And so my lens onto these issues has also been very much now filtered through news and online media. And it feels like a very palpable shift compared to, let's say, 5 years ago. In many ways, I feel hope, actually. I see the solidarities that are happening between Black Lives Matter and Stop AAPI Hate, or just activism against anti-Asian violence. Of course, there's also huge tensions between those two communities, but even in a specific Buddhist sense, I see discussions of race being lifted much more, being engaged with much more. When Aaron was writing his blog, he got so much flack from people for being like, you're being divisive, race is illusory. Like, what are you talking about? Like, there are people who swore at him and signed their posts angry Aryan Buddhist. I mean, all of that rhetoric is still there, but I think that Aaron today would see there's so much actually more support and awareness, a kind of reckoning happening. I would say even in Buddhist circles, a kind of realization that, oh, we're reaching the limits of two Buddhisms, and we're beginning to understand both the ways we've erased Asian Americans, but also are not necessarily being, as inclusive as we can be of BIPOC writ large. So I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, and conversations about race are really uncomfortable, right? I mean, they're not comfortable. And I think Buddhist communities can actually provide a powerful space where people practice having these conversations in a way that's rooted in our Buddhist values, ethics, and our Buddhist practices. And my hope is always, it's kind of like, how do we become kalyanamitta? How do we become spiritual friends? Like, maybe sometimes we can't become the best of friends with everyone, but how can we at least become friends enough that we're not going to harm each other, right? Or that we might be able to meet over a cup of tea and talk about some of these issues. I hope that discussing issues of race doesn't become like this chore people have to do. Like, I have to check off these 5 books I have to read, because first of all, it's not going to be done in a day. So I think part of the issue is we balance the kind of urgency, which is also very important, with this question of sustainability. How can we do this work? And a lot of the efforts we're doing, we may not see the fruits of them in our lifetimes. I think Buddhist teachings actually do a beautiful job of reminding us maybe that's okay. Like, so much of what we inherit now is the gifts of our ancestors. And I mean our ancestors writ large, not just people who look like me, right? But I think of all the Buddhist ancestors, or all the ancestors that have given us the ability to practice, to at least the vision of a nation that is religiously plural and racially plural. And I guess one thing I would like to mention here for the audience today is a gathering on May 4th called May We Gather, a National Buddhist Memorial Ceremony for Asian American Ancestors, that I've been helping co-organize with Duncan Rukin Williams and Punis Chu. So the link, if hopefully someone can put it in the chat, is www.maywegather.org. And May 4th, we chose this day because it's the 49th day after the Atlanta shootings. And in many Buddhist traditions, 49 days is a really important turning point, both we believe for the dead to transition to a next life, but also just an important transition point for those of us who are bereaved and suffering. And I know the Atlanta shootings have really affected so many of us in the United States and Canada, really around the world, the kind of shock and horror of it, the grief around it, the anger it's brought up, just so many different emotions. And so our hope for this ceremony is that it can be a space of healing, of reminding us of our deep interconnectedness. And it can be a space for us to come together actually in ritual and ceremony, aspects of Buddhist practice that maybe aren't always so highlighted in the mainstream media. So we'll have 49 Asian American Buddhist leaders from many different communities, as well as ally Buddhists there. And by there will be, so for those of you watching, I warmly invite you to come watch the live stream. And it'll be, I suppose, a bit of a hybrid event, because there will actually be people following COVID guidelines, right? But these Buddhist leaders will be gathering at Higashi Honganji Temple in Los Angeles. And the choosing of that location is also very deliberate, since it was vandalized earlier this year. And in fact, we'll also have participation from Vietnamese American monastics whose temples were vandalized. I know there have been Vietnamese temples vandalized in Montreal just in the past year. So it's really a coming together, we hope, of people from all different backgrounds. And you can watch the live stream. You can endorse the event as an individual or encourage your temples to endorse the event. So it's all available on the website. But for me personally, none of this has been expected. A book, I'd say, has its own karma. It gets born when it wants to be born. I was very fortunate to have a wonderful publisher, and to have it land now during this time has been very moving for me, actually. And to help just be a very small part in creating this gathering has also been quite healing, actually, for me to realize that as Asian American Buddhists, we can remember that even though it's so isolating during these times, we're actually very interconnected. There's so many people who support us. And I think this gathering will very tangibly, through chant and through reciting names and through us, offering light, offering flowers, we do this all together. And we come together in this way to remind ourselves that we really are interconnected across time, across geography, across these boundaries of race and all of these other boundaries that we construct.
As a practitioner of Pure Land Buddhism and someone who spent quite a bit of time in Japan at Higashi Honganji, when I read the news that Higashi Honganji, the LA Betsuin, had been vandalized, it really hit home. So I am moved that it is happening at the Betsuin, and look forward to joining in the live stream. You mentioned different boundaries that we construct, and one of these boundaries that has been part of this spate of anti-Asian violence is the disproportionate targeting of women of color and Asian women. I don't know if I have a firm question, but I know that this intersectionality means that being Asian woman and Buddhist is multiplied. There's a multiplier. There is a vulnerability associated with that nexus of identities. So I'm curious about your thoughts and how you've been grappling with this particular kind of identity. And I am also thinking of this in relationship to some of the incidents that occurred or that you describe in such vivid detail in your book. One of these is a description of Korean Zen women, I should say, Korean Buddhist women at temples, and they're described as watered down, or as practicing a form of watered down Buddhism. If you were to, and this is a quote, to travel to the beautiful Zen temples of Korea, a country where Buddhism is still alive and well, you'll see all the ladies in the temples working their malas, so their beads, chatting about their kids, sometimes shucking peas. The temples are very much village and urban gathering places. How many people are really deeply practicing? So there's this questioning of whether this kind of women's activity is real or authentic Buddhist. Then there's another, whereas this idea that changing the venue back to the United States, there's a claim that in the last 5-10 years, the first ceremony in America where the Dharma was transmitted through 3 generations of lay women, a Dharma blessing from kind of Dharma grandmother to Dharma mother to Dharma daughter. And that this represents a sea change in Buddhism. When I read that, and when I read the quote on watered down Korean women's Buddhism, I thought, wow, somebody's not paying attention to Asian women in the United States and Canada if they think at all that there is a lack of Dharma transmission, and that the first time that this has happened is in the last 5-10 years. So a big set of questions: gender, womanhood, intersectionality.
I'm just so appreciative of you naming that. I think even just to name that intersection can be so powerful, especially there's been so much erasure. I think that's particularly painful to name that that nexus is particularly painful. And yeah, reading that quote myself, even if the intention was not to be hurtful, it just really hurts. Like no one wants to think about their mom or their grandma, and no one in the Asian American community wants us to think about, our family that way, or our friends elders that way, or elders that way, right? Oh, there's so much I could say. I'm reminded of another point in the book where I mentioned this article about, it was like this Huffington Post article, like 10 Buddhist women everyone should know. And it was nine white Buddhists, convert Buddhists who are doing wonderful work, and that's all wonderful. And then it was, and I'm very happy to see their work lifted. But then it was the 10th person was Mahapajapati, the Buddha's aunt, who was, so it was like, oh, really? And as on my interview said, the only person you could think of was this very long dead Asian person. And I think there's something about that, though, about how sort of Asians, the way that Asians maybe are seen as sort of, oh, it's an ancient practice from Asia. And we forget the contributions of Asians and Asian Americans and Asian diasporic peoples have been crucial. Like there would be no Buddhism without all these people. And frankly, there would be no Buddhism without the people who are shucking peas and talking about their families and working their malas and supporting the communities. I mean, to me, these people are the bedrock of Buddhism around the globe. When I read that quote, I think, but how do you think community is made? Community is made one chant and one family and one meal at a time. And so what you describe, I don't know, it's the exact opposite to me of watered down Buddhism. And again, I think what pains me the most is the kind of very real effects. I mean, in my book, I talk about there's sometimes reluctance to even come out as a Buddhist, because who wants to be seen as superstitious, right? Who wants to be seen as practicing an inferior form of the religion? And I think that also, I think I just want to name openly that gender wasn't necessarily a key factor of analysis in my book. And I hope future books will really take that on more, gender, and especially LGBTQIA plus issues, and also class. I think the nexus of all those things, while touched upon throughout my book, is not one of the, key figures, but especially in this time of anti-Asian violence, just talking with Asian American Buddhist friends, and especially women, the ways that we fear going out. And then we especially fear for our elders, and especially for those who are in, not in wealthy neighborhoods, who so again, like that intersection of how class is there. So I think that hurt and that fear is very real. And again, part of our impetus for the gathering is wanting to have a response to that. We'll be ending with a kind of Purita ceremony, very common in Theravada traditions, where we use thread, a protective thread that's tied from the Buddha to all of us. And it's a symbolic act, but I think it's also a reminder of, in this time, there's the fear. And so, how do we respond? How do we create ways where we truly lower the probability of these harms? How do we make sure we protect each other and reach out and protect those we love? And I hope that more of that also becomes possible as more people get vaccinated and as the pandemic lifts, because I think that's been one of the hardest things during this time. You see these women's Buddhism in the temples, right? Who's feeding you, right? Who's lighting, who's just bowing, who's cleaning, and who's like doing all this work to maintain the temple, supporting the monastics, offering dana. Of course, who are nuns, who are upholding many other, Buddhist temples, themselves great leaders as well. So like in sort of all these levels of Buddhism, though, certainly patriarchy is real. But I guess I'll also say this, sometimes there's this feeling of like American Buddhism, like we're so much better than this Asian Buddhism that's so patriarchal. It's like, I don't quite think you've actually eliminated the patriarchy problem there, right? So I think remembering together, like there's these big isms that we're all tackling, like sexism and racism and homophobia, all of this, like that exists in all different communities because we're human. And so how do we come together, not say like, oh, they're doing it wrong, I'm doing so much better, but in a kind of more Buddhist spirit, understanding, wow, we're all interconnected. Our actions always affect each other. So how do we unite in solidarity and start addressing these issues. And I think a really important first step is just as you've, so important, so powerfully done, is just even naming the issue and naming that it's an issue, I think is a very important starting point.
I am looking at the clock and I note that we have about 15 minutes left. And this is the point at which we really wanted to bring in our audience and bring in questions. So I see that we have 3 questions so far that have come up in our Q&A segment of the webinar. So if you have questions, please do feel free to add these in. And what I'll do is I will invite our guest, Chenxing, to choose questions to respond to and or pick some and add. And I, of course, have many more questions, which we will not have time for, but no problem. So please, if you will, if you can see the questions or if you would like me to deliver them to you, either way is fine.
Sure. Let me just read from Karen Ferguson. I'm wondering if you can say something about monastic ordination among young Asian Americans today. The scholarship I've read often dismisses it even as a possible aspiration, but that seems very unlikely to me. Thanks so much, Karen. I really appreciate that question because I also recognize, I feel like this is another book that I hope my book can, help spawn, I guess. I think that we really need a lot more future research on this. In my book, I only have a couple of monastics whom I was able to interview, but absolutely, I think there are quite a lot. And, within the Plum Village tradition, but also within Taiwanese and Chinese. And I think perhaps, I think like what we need is like good sociological study, because what about in Southeast Asian communities, in these different communities, especially in Southeast Asian Theravada communities, is there temporary ordination happening? Certainly. How many people decide to do long-term ordination? And so I'm sorry I can't answer this question in greater depth because it's not my kind of specialty, but I think it's really important to think about this group. And I've also been thinking in conversation with, for example, Taiwanese and Taiwanese American nuns who maybe have grown up in the US but are working in Australia or even in Taiwan, and the kinds of, they're able to get this kind of transnational perspective, right? And be these sorts of bridge people. I think it's not an easy space to be, but I think they can both appreciate some of the racial dynamics that happen in the US, but also they can understand how in some Asian contexts that's less understandable because people are used to being more of an ethnic majority or a racial majority as well, or even a religious majority in Buddhist spaces. And so there's a lot of bridging. And I think, Jessica and I have talked a little bit today about ceremony and ritual, but I think that that's just a very deeply important piece. And Venerable Jin Chuan in my book talked about that as well, of like, how do we learn to appreciate this inheritance that we've been given? How do we adapt it to the American context? How do we especially help young Asian Americans see the value in this inheritance, not just say like, oh no, it's not seated meditation, so like this is just all superstitious, but to really understand and participate and see the very real beauty and power and strength in that practice. Jessica, do you want to read the next question? Just so I'm not
Yes, so
speaking
we have
forever.
an anonymous question regarding how to deal with experiences of racism in a practice context. So our attendee writes, I'm one of 2 Asians in my predominantly white Sangha, and I have received and observed acts of microaggression and racism towards the people of color in our community. Do you have any advice as to how to approach uncomfortable conversations and skillful means around transforming this? I've mainly stayed silent about it. However, lately I've begun to try to have conversations. Some have been supportive and receptive, and others have become defensive and act like there isn't an issue.
Thank you. I think first I just want to say I'm sorry that you've experienced these microaggressions. And I'm also, I suppose, both sorry and not sorry to say that I've heard so many people say it's just almost verbatim exactly what you're shared. So I'm very grateful for you for lifting this up. And there's so much here. I think that I'm probably not going to be able to find it on the fly now. There's a really beautiful, also anonymous quote from someone in his Chinese American in a Zen community who talks about just how tense and difficult it is. We want to practice and we want to be spiritual friends in spiritual community with everyone. And so when these moments happen, they really hurt. And I guess one of my first pieces of advice is first to make sure you're able to take care of yourself. And sometimes that means removing yourself from that environment or finding support from whether it's an affinity sangha or just from people who can understand where you're coming from. So I think that kind of tending to our own hurt is really important. And then understanding that it's, again, you're right. These conversations are uncomfortable. So for finding the people who are maybe willing to be in that discomfort with you, willing to learn together and be in it for maybe the long haul, right? That some people will be defensive. And I think something that's important is not to take it personally. You know, that's easier said than done. But when faced with that defensiveness, and sometimes I even think when faced with these microaggressions, on my best days, when I take a step back, when I share what happened with other people, and I really do encourage you to the extent possible not to stay silent with people for whom it feels safe to talk about this. I find for myself, it's so necessary to have these friends whom I just process these moments with. Just say, can you help me see a different way? Or can you just affirm that you too would feel hurt in this situation? Or shocked or embarrassed, or like just maybe even embarrassed on behalf of the other person or something like that. And I think just remembering there's so many systems that influence who we are, systems and beliefs and logics around white supremacy or Christian supremacy that's playing out in all of these communities. So I think sometimes, as much as we'd love for our Buddhist and religious spaces to be perfect and totally conflict free, I think arguably that's actually a model of what some people in the Kingian nonviolence community call a negative peace, that there's a sort of surface appearance of peace, but in the long run, this is not going to create the kinds of sustainable change we need to really talk about these moments and try to raise understanding and awareness. And I think in ways that invite other people in, sort of like, how can we do this? Like, I want to invite you to a cup of tea. What you said was really hurtful for me. Would you be willing to talk with me about it? I think that model versus the cancel culture model is probably more sustainable for us going forward. But again, I just recognize it is easier said than done. So I think it's a practice in having forgiveness for ourselves and forgiveness for each other, and just allowing room for feelings of anger or sadness or all of it. I think it's really important not to just bypass those emotions, but to let ourselves feel them. And hopefully, then we can transform those emotions into a direction that creates more community and more healing.
I see our next question is from my colleague at UBC, Dagmar Schwerk, who is a specialist of Bhutanese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. And she asks, how can we take these important issues and bring them up when we're discussing things that aren't modern, that aren't Buddhism in America or Buddhism in Canada, that isn't modernism? So how can we get to this set of incredibly important issues when we're not necessarily teaching on a topic that makes it easy?
Great question. I feel like that would be great to like have a panel on this, like a pedagogy panel, right? Okay, I'm looking at the time. I know we have a few more questions. So I guess very briefly, I think it's always, I think just um, it's relevant in terms of, I think one thing I wish another book will do is like think about Asian American Buddhists and also more historically. And I know people are doing that kind of work, but I think just even thinking about identity construction, that's relevant for people of all times, right? So I think sort of bringing that lens to the historical work, but also having students connect it to their own experience, sort of hierarchies of ethnicity or race. That happens, these sorts of power hierarchies, that happens throughout history. So I think there's many ways to actually just, if we slightly broaden the conversation, we can bring in all these themes. And in fact, I think that's so important because it's also, having lived outside of the US, when I come back here, I remember that there's ways in which very insular, even right now, right? I'm talking in quote unquote Canada, and I'm sort of overusing the word America to mean only the United States and not including North America or Canada. And I think even we don't talk about the Americas in a hemispheric perspective, but that is also really important for thinking about Buddhism. So, in other words, I think this kind of comparative perspective is really, really important. And so, bringing that historical comparative perspective, some of the terminology will certainly be different, but the broader concepts, power, representation, identity, that kind of thing, are very much at play.
I'm actually going to skip to, oh, sorry, no, I'm not. I think this is a question coming from a place of how to imagine practice. Sometimes what you want to do or doing what makes you happy, say this is chaplaincy, activism, or writing, won't necessarily get you to where you want to be financially or socially. Do you have any sense of how young Asian American Buddhists are approaching this problem? Are they pursuing their interests, or are they giving them up for something that is more, the word here is realistic. I'm assuming realistic means they can support themselves and eat.
Yeah, I love this question. Actually, one of my interviewees, Keith Truong, mentioned this kind of same thing. I mean, for himself as a Vietnamese American immigrant to this country, you know, unfortunately, chaplaincy, activism, writing don't pay very well. And I think those are very real considerations. So I would say, I think the short answer is yes, Asian American Buddhists are grappling with this. I think, and for, I realize it's because of extraordinary privilege that I'm able to do the work that I'm doing right now, that I'm supported by so many people. And it pains me that not everyone is able to, pursue those pursue these passions of theirs. I think there's also very complex dynamics for those of us who are, second generation immigrants, for example, and parental expectations. I talk about some of that in the book as well. Even some people whose parents were Buddhist would dissuade them from going down more Buddhist paths because I think it comes from a place of concern. They want to make sure their kid is going to be okay, like financially stable, like, yeah, have a roof over their heads, food to eat. And Buddhism, unfortunately, is not really associated with material gain. I shouldn't say unfortunately, I suppose that's just the truth, in terms of like pursuing a Buddhist path may not be the way to, get wealth and riches. But there's more I could say about this, but I'm looking at the time and I realize the time is short, but I just appreciate this question because I think it will resonate with a lot of Asian Americans. I mean, even in the ways we're seen as model minorities, I think it actually even delimits the possibilities of what we can do and how we can imagine. So perhaps to end on a slightly more positive note, I would say that I think there are lots of Asian Americans who are, nonetheless, because they are drawn, they have an affinity for Buddhism, affinity for the Dharma, we find ways, right, to weave it into our life. And maybe it seems small, but small is better than nothing. So even when I talk about Buddhism's impact on my own life, I feel it's a bit like, I call it like water, like a tea bag steeping in water. It just, the flavor of tea intensifies over time. So we start in little ways as we can. And hopefully we're lucky enough to be supported by spiritual friends of Buddhist communities. And we're able to still have the Dharma be part of our life, even if there are these pragmatic concerns that also weigh on us.
This brings us to a great last question to end on, and this is from Eric Swanson. He thanks you for today's talk and for your wonderful book. And he wants to talk about the Aaron lineage, which you brought up in a half-joking way, but says, but what if we took that seriously? What if we entertain that idea? What do you think an Aaron lineage Buddhism would look like? Would it be, would it mean to be the refuge? Or what would it mean to be the refuge in this lineage? How might one practice this? And what kind of community do you envision as associated with Aaron lineage Buddhism?
Oh, I love this question so much. Thank you, Eric, for this beautiful question. I think this Aaron lineage would look like, well, a big beaming smile. That's Aaron. I think it would look like sharing food together. The times I got to meet him in person, he was always like making cookies or making soup, or we were getting vegan food together, getting food with people. You know, I think it would look like having room for the meditation and the ritual. This is something that Aaron was just comfortable going to different communities. He was actually primarily, meditation was a very important part of his practice, but he was the one who told me about Jodo Shinshu community having a Techno Buddha conference, right? So he just had made friends with people of all different backgrounds. I think this the friendliness, and Aaron is also really a language buff, but he would also go to a community. It didn't matter if he didn't really know the language; he would learn a few words right away, and just even if it was kind of uncomfortable, I think starting from that place of friendliness, I think it is a Be the Refuge lineage. And I joke that, the book is not called Go Meditate Now, which might be great for some people and maybe isn't the right thing for other people. But Be the Refuge, I think, is meant to be open and creative and expansive. There's so many ways we can be the refuge, including shucking peas. And so we figure out for ourselves, like we do our little part. What's the best way we can be a refuge together? What's the best way we can build spiritual friendship together? So this is a question I know I'll be pondering even much more after this conversation, but thanks again, Eric, for that beautiful question.
I hope Aaron lineage Buddhism becomes a thing. I know I've been inspired by him, and yeah, thank you so much for this book. And thank you to Banyen Books for the opportunity to discuss it. I encourage people to email questions. I'm just going to put my institutional email in the chat here. And of course, on the various websites, you can find ways to contact our author, Chenxing Han, if you have further questions. So please don't be shy, reach out if you've got things to ask or things you want to connect about.
Chenxing Han's book, Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, is available from Banyen Books and Sound. Visit banyen.com, BANYEN.com. Thank you again. It's been an honor to welcome you, Chenxing and Dr. Main. To all have joined from around the world today, farewell until next time.